Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast and YouTube show for SQL Server developers and database administrators. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. Today's episode is number 36, and we are going to be talking about troubleshooting a case of expanding transaction log growth. And it's an interesting one. I alluded to this at the end of the last episode. I talked about getting an availability group question that I was able to actually solve by email relatively quickly, and how that was kind of a big shock. Well, in today's episode, we're going to cover what that question was. Now, before I get started, I do want to talk about just stuff I'm excited about that I've been working on in the last week. I want to make the story of starting up SQL Workbooks and just what I'm working on. I want to kind of work that story into the podcast as well, and just give you an update on where I am every week. And I want to talk about not just the good things, but occasionally talk about what's harder than I thought it was, what's been tricky, and just getting past it. Just the story of starting up a little training site. One of the biggest things I did in the last week that I'm proud of, it doesn't seem like I never thought I would be like, I'm really proud to have started a weekly newsletter, right? But I actually am. I'm doing these things that kind of, it's like, yeah, it's a legitimate business. And I had the idea to start up a weekly quiz and to have a newsletter that I send out each week that has, just information about what's going on in the SQL Server world, as well as a link to a fun quiz. One of the things that's harder than I thought it was is originally I wanted to see if I could get the quiz into the email itself. It's really hard to get interactive quizzes into an email format because everybody uses a different, inbox, right? So it's a link to a landing page that has a quiz on, and you can take the quiz and see how you did each week. To sign up for the weekly quiz letter, go to SQLWorkbooks.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, and look for the little dinosaur with a little envelope in his hand, and put your email address in, and you can get the weekly newsletter, aka the weekly quiz letter. But it took some research to figure out how to get it all to work. I did the first one this week. It was really fun. And I got some feedback that people had fun doing the quiz, which is what it's all about. So I'm looking forward to writing a quiz each week, and I'm going to play around and see if I can get fancier with getting, little drawings and diagrams more deeply into the quiz questions itself. Maybe some pictures of execution plans. We'll go crazy. That's my style of going crazy, is getting execution plans into the weekly quiz, right? Partying as usual. Other stuff that's going on. So one of the things to know about, and if you're listening to this presently, this is going to impact you more than if you're listening this into the future. It's currently March 2017. SQLPASS is planning for their summit in 2017, and they currently have a survey out there that they want you to take to your input on what content you would like to see at the summit in 2017. And you can totally fill out the survey even if you don't have tickets to the summit yet. In fact, if you enter your email address at the bottom of the survey, you can enter to win a free registration to the summit. So they want your feedback, and they're going to have a drawing to give away a registration. And I'm not sure, they're giving away at least one. I don't recall if it's more than one, but they're giving away at least one free registration. If you're interested in taking the survey, head over to pass.org, click on blog, and check out Wendy's post on summit content. It has a link. For those of you watching on YouTube, I've got the link on the screen. So check that out. If you are a speaker and you are interested in submitting a pre-conference session for the PASS Summit this year, they're changing the process a little bit this time, and they want you to send this letter of intent. They have a little form for you to fill out. It's on the exact same blog post. So if you are interested in giving a pre-con, go to pass.org, click on blog and check out Wendy's post to get that form that you need to send them by April 7th to let them know. You don't have to write a full abstract. You just kind of let them know about you, your experience, and what area you'd like to present in. So I just wanted to try to help get the word out about that, especially because there's, a contest to win a free summit registration. How cool would that be to win that? I think that would be awesome. On to this week's question about log growth. So I've got it's kind of a longer question, and it goes like this. Sometimes I got this from a reader. She said, sometimes my transaction log file grows and it won't shrink, and I can't figure out why. So for example, this weekend, the transaction log backups weren't running because of a disk space issue. We resolved the issue and the backups resumed on schedule, but still I couldn't shrink the transaction log file. Some more information. I used DBCC SQL perf log space to confirm that it was really using the space, and DBCC SQL perf log space showed that it was using 98% of 27 gigabytes. I ran select star from sys.databases, and it showed that the reuse wait reason was availability replica. All of our replicas, we have one synchronous and one asynchronous, are up to date. The database is in an availability group. I put the asynchronous replica into synchronous mode for about an hour to see if that helped, but no luck. I used DBCC OpenTran to confirm there were no old transactions. It didn't show anything there. And DBCC log info shows all status too. Why won't my transaction log shrink? So I loved this mail because I got, a lot of information here. But my immediate response was one of concern, because this can be a really, really big deal. The very first thing I wrote in the email, or I responded with, was, if this is a critical system and you're close to running out of space for your log, we're going to get in an outage situation. If our log has to grow and we run out of space and it can't grow and we can't just add more, this can be really sticky. And the fact that we have the database in an availability group would imply that it's a really important database. So a ticket with Microsoft support is $500. They'll see the issue through to the end of the issue. So I was like, I wanted to, I've got some ideas and I've got some questions, but, you don't necessarily want to wait on some lady on the internet who may or may not, she's got to go walk her dog while your transaction log is filling up. So also this Microsoft deal, $500 might sound like a lot of money in some situations, but we're talking about a flat fee. This isn't like the starting fee for the ticket. This is the cost of the whole ticket. And if you're facing an outage or a flat fee of $500, I would always pick the flat fee. It's right. You've spent money on enterprise licensing. So I do want to say that, if you're watching this video and you are in a critical situation, Microsoft support, they're there for you, flat fee, right? I am not going to be able to answer your question in a comment on the YouTube video with the speed, accuracy, and precision for Microsoft support. So let's talk a little bit about the issue, having gotten that important information out of the way. And it is important. I'm not being sarcastic. Let's talk a little bit about when the transaction log grows. And at this point, let's not think about the availability group, but let's think about a database that's in the full recovery model. We've got a database in the full recovery model and it has a transaction log. The transaction log has virtual log files that make it up. Your transaction log is really made up of sort of chunks of transaction log. And this is just sort of the way that the log is managed. Let's say that, just to keep it simple, we only have 4 virtual log files. When we first start out, none of them are used. We've created a new database, it's in the full recovery model, none of them are used. As we start committing transactions that change data, inserts, updates, and deletes, all of our transactions have a log sequence number, or LSN. And when they're written to the log, they, have this LSN associated with their log records. And that helps keep track of what transactions have been doing right so far. And some of these transactions are committed. Some of these transactions aren't committed. Let's say in our example, we do have some cases where, we did begin tran and we've started doing stuff and we haven't committed yet. So now we have one section, one of those virtual log files is in use. We have 4, so we still have 3 that are unused. We do more work and we fill up that little virtual chunk of the log and we go on, and now the second chunk of the log is in use. It's got active transactions that are using it. And we've got, so basically half of our log. 2 of the virtual log files are in use, 2 are still unused. We keep on doing work. Now we've used 3 out of the 4 virtual log files. We've only got 1 that's unused. Well, at this point, we run a transaction log backup. I mentioned that we were in the full recovery model, and when we run our transaction log backup, SQL Server sees that our first virtual log file, all of the transactions that use that first VLF, they have all committed. And now they've all been backed up. Everything that wrote to that VLF is not an open transaction. It's a committed transaction, and we have completed a log backup of it. So that first VLF in the log can be what's called truncated. Now, truncated doesn't mean that SQL Server physically goes into the VLF and overwrites everything. It really is SQL Server saying, I can reuse this virtual log file for other stuff. So our first VLF has been truncated. We have 2 more VLFs that have active transactions in them. We've run a log backup, but they're still open transactions that wrote to those 2 virtual log files, so we can't reuse them yet. And then we have a 4th unused VLF. We keep on writing, and SQL Server uses that 4th virtual log file. The log is what's called circular. So when we finish using that 4th virtual log file, SQL Server says, I can wrap around and start the first virtual log file. It has been truncated. I can reuse it. This is part of, why the log file doesn't always have to grow, because the log file is circular. So as long as we are committing our transactions, frequently, if not immediately, as long as we don't have super long running transactions, and we're doing log backups if our recovery model requires it, the virtual log files can be reused and the log doesn't have to grow. We will run into situations, depending on the nature of the activity in our database and the size of our log files. Sometimes we will have to grow the log if we don't have a virtual log file that we can reuse, maybe because we haven't been running log backups, or they broke because of a lack of space, maybe because we have active transactions. There are other factors too that can prevent log reuse. Maybe we're using a technology that reads from the transaction log, like replication or change data capture. We can't just write over stuff in the log that hasn't been picked up by replication or CDC. Also, technologies like database mirroring and availability groups read from the, sync data from the transaction log file. So if we have an availability group replica who's offline and can't sync the data over, we can't just write over it in the transaction log, right? So if we got mirroring or AGs, we have to be really conscious of that. Also in memory, if we have in-memory tables, we've got to synchronize from the transaction log to the in-memory OLTP checkpoint files, because those have their own process of, if we're saying we want the data to be durable in memory OLTP, we can't just overwrite it in the log before it's been sent elsewhere, so that if we lose power or our SQL Server restarts, we can get the data back. So it gets the more features that we use in SQL Server, the more complex figuring out why did my log grow, the more complex that problem is. Now that we've talked a little bit just about log basics, let's review the facts as we know them so far from our reader. DBCC SQL perf log space. That command answers the question, how large are your log files? It actually gives you a result set for all the databases on your instance. How big are the files? In this case, 27 gigabytes, not like a tiny log file. I mean, this isn't the biggest log file in the world. I don't want to know what the largest SQL Server transaction log file in the world is, actually. I really would rather not know. And we know that the percentage used in the log is 98%. We also know that the log file is growing, over time. We know that DBCC OpenTran was run. DBCC OpenTran is a command that'll give you the oldest active transaction within a given database. This command isn't bad, but I prefer to run the free stored procedure SP_whoisActive from Atom Mechanic because I'm really lazy. And SP_whoisActive, you can just run it on the whole instance. You don't have to use every database. It also will give you information about the command, the T-SQL that's being run for the session and how long it's been there as well. It gives you the information from DBCC OpenTran plus a lot more info. So I like to run that because usually or often, I don't know if it's usually, but often we have more than one database in an availability group. It might be interesting to know how many single database availability groups we have, a group of one. But you don't have to, with SP_whoisActive, since you don't have to use every database, it allows you to be lazier. But we got the information that there weren't any open transactions. We also got information about DBCC log info. I believe this one is an undocumented command. I'm not 100% sure, but I think DBCC log info is undocumented. It's been blogged about a lot. It's got a reputation. It will show you those virtual log files for a database and return sort of some cryptic information about them, stuff like the starting offset of the virtual log file. And there's this status column in it that has a number for the status, and you can do some searching online and try to figure out what the status is. In this case, all the VLFs had a status of 2. And a status of 2 means that the virtual log file is active and is not available for reuse. Now, DBCC log info is a little tricky. It works a little differently, or this virtual log files, I guess I should say, work a little differently when it comes to databases that use availability groups or database mirroring. There is something that SQL Server does called lazy log truncation. I am not the only one who's lazy. SQL Server is lazy too. And there's a great post. If you want to learn more about lazy log truncation, there's a post on the SQLPFE blog. So if you search SQLPFE lazy log truncation, I bet you'll find it. And they explain kind of more about what this means, but essentially the takeaway is if your database is in an availability group or database mirroring, having a status of 2 on your VLFs, actually those VLFs may be able to be reused because it's being lazy about actually reusing them. In other words, I wouldn't rely too much on DBCC log info to troubleshoot log growth when you've got mirroring or an availability group because it may just show you 2 no matter what. But in this case, we do know that the log is growing. So the fact that the log is growing confirms to us that the VLFs have a status of 2, right? So I wouldn't rely too much on DBCC log info in this case, but we have the information we need from the fact that the log is growing. If you're in a situation, if you're listening to this and you're frowning, you're like, but I want to monitor this. There's other things in this case that would serve you better for monitoring than DBCC log info. If you're using an availability group, there is a dynamic management view named sys.dmhadr, which stands for Hadron, which is one of the former names of this, database replica states. So you could search for DMV database replica states. And this contains a lot of useful columns about the state of your AG. It also contains a column named low watermark for ghosts. The description from Books Online for this says, if this number is not increasing over time, it implies that ghost cleanup might not happen, and the minimum value of this is going to be used across all replicas. This is a little bit of foreshadowing. I just wanted to say, like, if you're like, oh man, DBCC log info isn't that useful, know that if you're working with availability groups, there are other DMVs that can help you out on this. One of the simpler DMVs, which our questioner looked at, and I was so happy to see the information about this, is sys.databases. Our good old friend sys.databases is actually really useful here because there's a column named log reuse weight. And if you look at that, it will give you just, hey, if my log is growing, and I look at that, that's a good initial place to look at, just like, okay, well, what are you waiting on? Why can't logical segments of the log be reused? And in this case, the reason was availability replica. So it is pointing towards the availability group as to why the log is growing. Summing up what we know now. The transaction log is full and growing. The database is in an availability group. SQL Server says that availability groups, the reason that the log can't be reused, or VLFs in the log can't be reused. And secondary databases are caught up and are not delayed. We don't have like a replica who's offline anywhere. We're in a synchronized state. I didn't ask too much in this case about whether anybody might be behind, but the information I got was that they were caught up. So I had a couple questions that I asked. The question that I asked first turned out to be the most helpful question. And the question was, did you check for open transactions on every readable secondary database? Or did you just look at the open transactions on the primary? I asked this because it would be natural to just run DBCC OpenTran against the primary replica. And to, when you're looking at its transaction log, where we think of open transactions might be a problem is the primary replica. But availability groups are complicated, and open transactions elsewhere can actually cause big problems too. If you have a long operation on a secondary database, a big open transaction that's doing lots of work over a long time, it can block something called ghost cleanup in the primary database. Now, this is the second time I've talked about ghosts. If you delete records, there are ghosts in your SQL Server. This is one of those things about like internals that I just love, is just the naming. And you can talk, when you're having a discussion about internals, you can talk very seriously about things like ghosts. Also phantoms in a different context. There's lots of there's a Halloween problem. Things can get really spooky. This is one of those little things. Ghost cleanup, to put it really simple, is a background task that cleans up after deletes. Because when you delete something, at first you mark it as deleted. You don't scrub it all up. And there's a background process that comes back and is like, I'm gonna really clean up after the deletes. Having a long open transaction on a secondary database means that it's not safe to clean up that stuff over on the primary replica, for a variety of complicated reasons. And this is true for both a synchronous replica and an async replica. We might think that by having an asynchronous replica, it's less likely to impact the primary, because if it's slower for it to, and I'm trying to be careful about the terminology I use, if it's slower to harden a transaction in the log on on the secondary replica and it's synchronous, that might slow down my write on the primary write. So we're like, if I make it asynchronous, it's less impact. And for certain patterns, that may be true, but still, things like long-running transactions, if we make that asynchronous secondary, if we make it readable, things like a long-running transaction on it can block things like ghost cleanup on our primary. And if ghost cleanup is blocked, this also blocks the log truncation process on the primary database. So long-running transactions on an availability group secondary, even if it's asynchronous, can make your transaction log grow on your primary replica. Now, if you are like, why is this the case? Like, why would this happen? There is a great blog post by Amit Banerjee all about, it's called Chasing the Ghost Cleanup in an Availability Group. So search Chasing Ghost Cleanup Amit, and you'll find his post. It's on his site, troubleshootingsql.com. And he gives you a great demo and lots of explanation as to why reading on a secondary would block ghost cleanup on the primary. It's a fantastic post. So I heard back from my new friend, and when I'm chatting with people about Dear SQL DBA questions, it's like having a coworker. I always feel, maybe that's why I like doing this show so much, is I feel like I have coworkers everywhere. But I heard back, and in fact, the cause of this problem, there was a system process open on an unused secondary, and a restart fixed things up. And she said, I didn't really want to issue a kill statement because it's a system process. So I did a SQL restart so that SQL closed down and kind of cleaned up the system process as part of the SQL restart. We're just using that replica for DR. And that did resolve the issue. Now, I totally don't blame her for doing the SQL restart. If I was in this situation and my log had been growing and growing and growing, and it wasn't a disaster yet, but like I wanted to know if I could fix it, and I've got a replica that's just for DR and it looks like it's part of the problem, I might do the same thing to quickly try and see if it clears it up too. But I am kind of like, well, what was the system process? Well, I don't know. I have no idea what the system process was. This could be a bug. If I could go back in time, I would want to know what SP Who is Active said about what that system, what T-SQL it was doing, and what it looked like, maybe what if it was blocked. I would also want to know, if you're running availability groups, there's an always on health extended event session, and it might have some background about any issues that had happened in the AG on that replica and like how it had gotten into that state. But I don't know what it is. I do know if you have an availability group, you got to be on the lookout for weird things happening on any of your replicas. That's kind of the game that you're in when you're managing an availability group, because the more complicated things get, the more complicated it gets to take care of them. And AGs are pretty complicated. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Dear SQL DBA. If you have a question, head to SQLWorkbooks.com/ask. There's also free courses you can take at SQLWorkbooks.com. I almost forgot the name of my own company there. My SQL Server Management Studio Tips and Tricks course, it's kind of interesting right now since all the courses are free. Management Studio Shortcuts and Secrets has outpaced already tuning problem queries and table partitioning. Now, I knew that might happen because table partitioning is pretty specialized and lots more people use Management Studio than table partitioning. But it's still pretty interesting to me that already, sorry, table partitioning, you're not winning the popularity contest. But I still love you. I still love you, table partitioning. That's it for this week. I'm Kendra Little, and I'll see you again soon.